It's really hard to talk to people in my community right now because they're really struggling. They are struggling so hard to make ends meet. I was at the grocery store a couple of weeks ago, and I watched a woman in my community take a loaf of bread out of the bakery aisle and look at it, and then put it back on the shelf, and then look at it, and then put it back on the shelf. And I knew what she was doing. She was asking herself, can I afford this? And that is the crisis that our country is facing right now. And that is the level of gravity that each of us should be treating the country's finances and our economic policy with right now. People in our country are asking themselves if they can afford to put another loaf of bread in their cart. So to me, Mr. Speaker, I have to ask myself why, and I really want to direct this to the Liberal backbench. Why are the Liberals raising taxes right now? Why would they do this? Why would they do this to that woman who is trying to figure out if she can afford an extra loaf of bread this week? There is no reason for the government to raise taxes, yet yesterday, that's what the government and the Liberals voted to do, to raise taxes. Every single member of the Liberal backbench has the ability in their caucus meetings, on their own social media platforms, to push back and hold the government to account just as much as I do. We all have that right. And in January, small business owners and employers shouldn't have to be worried about their payroll taxes increasing. And Canadians, that woman who is thinking about whether or not she can afford that extra loaf of bread, she shouldn't be thinking about whether or not that amount of take-home pay is going to go down because the government is taking more money off of her paycheck. It's ludicrous. We are in a generational inflation crisis. This is something that many Canadians have never had to deal with. And before this crisis even started, the Canadian economy was on the brink. We're seeing a mental health crisis, a housing crisis, and what are the Liberals doing? They want to raise taxes. And it's not just the payroll tax that the Liberals have voted to raise. It's also voting to raise taxes on something that will increase the cost of everything. So let's talk about a loaf of bread. The way that the Liberals, the way that the Prime Minister have approached dealing with inflation is, okay, Canadians, you have a loaf of bread, we're gonna take it from you and we're gonna give you back the crumbs. That's what we're debating here today, and that's not right. But let's talk about that loaf of bread. For a Canadian farmer who's growing the wheat for that bread, the Liberals want to raise taxes on the power that goes into drying that grain. What does that do to the cost of a loaf of bread? It increases it at a time when we can't afford it, when people are asking if they can put another loaf of bread into their car, Mr. Speaker. And then what about when that grain is dry? What happens to, how does that grain magically get to a processing plant? Well, it's transported, right? If it's transported in a truck, the fuel that goes to getting that grain to a processing plant, it's gonna increase with this tax increase. And who pays for that? The person who eventually is going to buy that loaf of bread. Now, once that flour is milled, that manufacturing plant, which might be looking to relocate because of payroll taxes and tax increases on their input costs like electricity, if they somehow manage to mill that flour, and that flour has to be transported somewhere else. And what happens? The tax on that gas gets increased too next year. In the middle of an inflationary crisis, when people are struggling to choose whether or not they're putting another loaf of bread in their car. And then what? How is that loaf of bread going to get to the grocery store, Mr. Speaker? How does that happen? It doesn't magically happen. It has to be transported. Again, using something that the Liberals are increasing the cost of. Again, raising taxes on this. Of course, that increase in taxes, it goes to the entire system. It raises the cost of everything. And here's the other thing. The Liberals try to tell people that somehow magically that bit of grain, that loaf of bread can magically get from one place to another because they failed to put any sort of substitute good for carbon into the market in spite of raising these taxes, in spite of doing that. And what have they done instead? So they've raised the cost of these goods. They've made it harder for that woman to choose whether or not she's putting that loaf of bread into her cart. And they've done this while making us more dependent on countries like Iran and Russia for their oil. And greenhouse gas emissions have rose under this government. They've got to stop. Like, to the Liberal backbench, hold your leader to account. One of them, Mr. Speaker, actually said something that made sense. They were quoted in a news article after their caucus meeting. And they said something to the effect, I wish the leadership of our party would stop being so woke and focus on inflation. Well, now's the time. Every single one of their community members is struggling with that question of whether or not to put another loaf of bread in their cart. And they don't want silence. Courage is lacking in that backbench right now. We should not be raising taxes. They had an opportunity yesterday to prevent the raise of taxes. And yet what did they do? They voted to raise taxes. It's got to stop. This is not the time to do that. Now, some of them will say, oh, but we're spending money on X, Y, and Z. Okay, let's talk about what the Liberals have been spending money on. A federal election in 2021 that got us what? A polarized electorate? And didn't do anything else for the Liberals, right? We just found out that they spent $500 million, making it easier for people in upstate New York to jump the immigration queue in Canada. And the other thing that they've done is they've spent, I don't know, how much money, and what? It takes what? 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months to get a passport? So not only are we seeing the government raise taxes in the middle of an inflationary crisis, service delivery is worse. And that's not good government. What we have here is a scandal-plagued government who does not give a rip about the price of bread. They don't give a rip. They don't understand what people in my community or any of their communities are going through to try and increase the cost of, or try to make ends meet when filling up their tank of gas. It's beyond me. It is beyond me that they would raise taxes right now, and we will fight back. This is crazy. They should not be raising taxes in the middle of an inflationary crisis. Give your head a shake. This is not a game. That is what each of the members of the Liberal backbench should be saying, is they have to do something to actually address the inflationary crisis. And taking Canadians' loaf of bread and trying to give them a few crumbs back and say that that's good enough is not good enough. And it has to stop. And Canadians are sharing this message. They're telling people, even people that have voted Liberal for the Liberals in the past have said, we had enough. We've had enough of, as one of their backbench said, this woke stuff. They want solutions. They want a solution to the problem. We should have energy sovereignty. We shouldn't be waiting for OPEC Plus to raise or lower production and raise the cost of energy on us because we don't have energy sovereignty here. They should be addressing the labor shortage instead of making it easier for people in upstate New York to skip the line into this country. They should be addressing the fact that we have the poorest levels of service in government programs in generations, while it is impossible for people to make ends meet, Mr. Speaker. And we should all have had enough with this cabinet and this government's failed approach to economic growth while our country stares down the barrel of a looming recession. And it's this government's problem. They have failed to repatriate manufacturing. They have failed to inspire investment in our country. And they are making it harder for women in my community to put loaves of bread in their cart. And I've had enough. And people in this place have had enough, Mr. Speaker. And people across this country have had enough. So I challenge every Liberal backbencher here today, tomorrow morning is their caucus meeting, to stand up and say what that one person said off the record to a reporter. Enough with the woke shit. Sorry, Mr. Speaker, I take that back. I apologize for my unparliamentary language immediately. I'm very sorry. Enough with the woke stuff. And get on with the plan. And it's right to be passionate with this because we have to do better things to protect Canadians from inflation.
I appreciate the retraction. Questions and comments? We have time for one. The honourable member for Kingston and the Islands.
Well, I appreciate the member's candor. She certainly speaks with passion, and sometimes I wish I could use language like that in here too, even if just accidentally. But my question, Mr. Speaker, is in relation to this member's private members bill. This member has a private members bill on cryptocurrency. We were actually supposed to debate it the first day that the House resumed, and we didn't for some reason. It got bumped. I understand that the member's private members bill on cryptocurrency is coming up in the next couple of days. I'm wondering if she can provide some insight into what her bill is about to inform this House.
The honourable member for Calgary Nose Hill.
Well, I'd invite my colleague to talk to the parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Finance, who actually holds digital assets in his ethics disclosure. I'd also invite him to talk to the Minister of Finance, who approved tens of thousands of dollars for a crypto trading platform in her own riding. This government has talked a big game on the digital economy, and now, when we're staring down the barrel of a recession, is trying to score cheap political points when we should be trying to grow jobs through a framework that protects investors and consumers while allowing the economy to grow. But this government doesn't get it, and that's a shame.
We'll have to break, and when we come back, the honourable member for Calgary Nose Hill will have 3 minutes and 45 seconds coming to